Welcome to the webinar on building volunteer involvement in your organization. I'm Autumn Crow, Program Director for West Virginia Rivers Coalition, and will be moderating this webinar. West Virginia Rivers is a statewide nonprofit that advocates for clean, drinkable, swimmable, and fishable rivers. This webinar is the first of a series of free webinars funded by West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection that's targeted towards local watershed groups throughout the state to help build capacity with your organizations. The presenter on this webinar is Caroline Bott, Leadership Development Manager with the River Network. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You should be seeing the slides on your screen, and there's an orange arrow at the top of your screen on the right-hand side that expands your webinar panel so you can see a chat box and all of the controls for the webinar. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available to download for reference following the webinar. Caroline will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, so you can type your questions anytime in the chat box at the bottom of your control panel. There's 3 handouts available for download that can be found under the Handouts tab: the slides for this presentation, a sample volunteer application form, an example of a handbook on volunteer policies and protocols. You'll also receive a short evaluation following the completion of the webinar. Please take a few minutes to rate your satisfaction with the webinar to help us improve future webinars in the series. And finally, once we get into the presentation, we'll have a quick poll to see what your biggest challenge is when working with volunteers. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Caroline.
Great, thanks Autumn for that introduction, and I want to thank the West Virginia Rivers Coalition for the opportunity to speak with the group today. I'm delighted to be here. As Autumn said, my name is Caroline Bott, and I'm a member of River Network's Leadership Development Team. I currently live on the eastern shore of Virginia near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. My background is in nonprofit management and fundraising, and I'm the former executive director of a watershed organization in the Highlands of Virginia. So I used to be a neighbor of West Virginia and glad to be on the line with you all this morning. I'd like to quickly go over our agenda. We'll begin by briefly looking at volunteer trends and statistics and what motivates volunteers. We'll talk about building a successful volunteer program, and I'll share some tips for volunteer engagement and management. We'll talk about ways in which you can steward your volunteers into leadership roles, and we'll discuss the importance of recognition and appreciation, and end with a quick look at liability waivers, conflicts, and volunteer burnout. And as Autumn said, we'll save some time at the end for questions. I want to start by sharing just a little bit about River Network. For 30 years, we filled a unique niche in the environmental community by focusing primarily on the 2,000+ river and watershed organizations that work at the local and state level, but we also strive to engage a much broader community to support healthy rivers and water resources. Our mission is to empower and unite people and communities to protect and restore rivers and other waters. Our staff includes scientists, water management and policy experts, lawyers, organizational development experts, and others who have a passion for helping rivers and people. And we offer one-on-one mentoring and consulting, trainings, resources, events, and conferences to strengthen the efforts of river and water champions. As I mentioned, part of our work includes trainings, and I wanted to call your attention to a current opportunity for our current dues-paying members. Some of you, hopefully on the line, may be members of River Network. These are offered free. We have gone through 3 of 5 of the fundraising essentials. Recordings are available, and we have 2 more coming up. The first is on making the ask, and the next is on fundraising technology, and those will be in February and March. We offer one-on-one mentoring and consulting, trainings, resources, events, and conferences, as I said. So our River Rally is in Lake Tahoe this year. And I would encourage anybody, if you're interested in attending, there's scholarships available till February 1st, I believe. So please check out our website for more information. Okay, as Autumn mentioned, we're going to start with a quick poll. Autumn, if you would go ahead and launch our poll, we'd like to know what your biggest volunteer program challenge is. And Autumn, if you just keep me posted on when the poll is open and when folks are voting.
We've got about 50% voted so far.
Great.
I'll give it a few more seconds and we'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Great, and unfortunately, I'm not able to see the results yet, and if you could share those, or at least let me know who voted, that would be great.
I've shared the results, and it looks like we have 40% say recruiting and cultivating volunteers, 16% said managing and supervising, 40% says retention and keeping volunteers engaged, and then just 4% for stewarding into leadership positions.
Okay, great. So that recruiting, cultivating, and engaging volunteers seems to be the top topics of interest today. And the good news is we're going to touch on all of these things. So thanks for your feedback, and let's go ahead and move on. So let's set the stage. If our hopes of building a better and safer world are to become more than wishful thinking, we need the engagement of volunteers more than ever. Kofi Annan, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and former Secretary General of the UN, said this in December of 2010 in honor of the 2011 European Year of Volunteering. I believe this quote captures the enormity of the value of volunteers, not just in our own organizations and at the local level, but beyond that to the world at large. Volunteering really is globally recognized as a key activity that promotes social inclusion and social justice, beginning at the grassroots level with you and me, and extending to societal changes at the local, national, and international levels. It brings benefits to both society at large and to the individual volunteers, and makes important contributions economically as well as socially, and contributes to a more cohesive society by building trust and reciprocity. So continuing along that theme, I like to think about volunteering as an opportunity. When we ask someone to volunteer, we're not asking for a favor or help. So get out of that mentality. What we're doing is we're asking them, or giving them, an opportunity to participate in making a difference in the world. River and watershed organizations are particularly suited to volunteer participation because your mission is to engage the community in caring about and taking care of your local rivers and its watershed. Every volunteer who takes your case to heart, your message to the community, and your mission into their lives brings us closer to achieving our collective goals. So let's take a minute and think about who volunteers and why. Think about a time you volunteered for some activity. Why did you decide to volunteer, and what were the benefits to you? What were your expectations, and was it a successful experience? Why or why not? Now ask yourself, what do people get out of volunteering for your organization? An opportunity to live out their values, to connect with nature or meet like-minded people, to get out of the house. As a new mother, this was my motivation when I got involved in my local watershed group. It could be an opportunity to develop new skills, or to fix a community program, or a chance to do something meaningful with your family member or friend. It may be to feel more connected to the community. The takeaway here is that the more you know about your volunteers, the more meaningful you can make their experience, which helps you build a strong relationship between you and them. You'll see in 2015, I've got statistics here from the Corporation for National and Community Service. It's the home of the most comprehensive look for volunteering and civic life in the United States. Their data includes volunteer and civic engagement rates and rankings, trends, and demographics for the nation, 50 states, and most major cities across the country. In their most recent data from 2015, West Virginia ranks 44th among the 50 states and DC in percentages of residents who volunteer. However, almost 3/4 of Mountaineers informally volunteer, for example, doing favors for their neighbors. West Virginia residents spent on average 28.5 hours volunteering per year, which equated to almost 40 million hours of service in 2015. The estimated value of that service was almost $1 billion. Looking at national trends, surprisingly, Generation X, 36 to 51-year-olds, had the highest volunteer rate of all groups at 29%, but not surprisingly, the silent or greatest generation, those 75 and older, had the highest median hours among volunteers at over 100 per person. Nationally, volunteers spent a median of 52 hours volunteering during the reporting year, and most volunteers were involved with either one or two organizations. Volunteers have a 27% higher odds of finding a job after being out of work than non-volunteers, possibly due to developing new skills and expanding personal networks. And volunteers are almost twice as likely to donate to charity as non-volunteers. So, you may be asking yourself, how do I take advantage of this wealth of knowledge and manpower? And so what we're going to talk about today is really building that volunteer culture within your organization. So where do you begin? You first need to ask yourself if you're ready for volunteers. Even if you already have a volunteer program, stop and answer these questions. Do you have a list of tasks to be done, and is it clear how these tasks will help your organization's mission? In order to successfully engage volunteers, you need to make sure that they feel connected to the work of your organization. Do you have the space and equipment for volunteers to perform these tasks? There's nothing worse than having volunteers show up for work and not being ready for them. Before they arrive, know who's coming, what you need them to do, and prepare for their activity, their space, equipment, and training. Do you encourage your members to become more involved by offering opportunities to volunteer? And do you have outlets to publicize your volunteer opportunities? Do you have a volunteer program budget? Many people think volunteers are free labor, but they're not labor free. There's a cost associated with recruiting, engaging, and supervising volunteers. And do you have a volunteer coordinator? Could be a full or part-time, paid or volunteer person. Different organizations have different needs and resources. Regardless, you need a dedicated person or persons to coordinate your volunteer program. And finally, do you have a way to track volunteers? It's important to have a system to maintain contact information, hours volunteered, and other important information. Your next step is to clearly identify and define tasks and opportunities for your volunteers. We recommend that you begin by looking at your existing program areas. Perhaps you have an education and outreach program, monitoring citizen science program, advocacy, or fundraising. In each of these areas, make a list of ways in which volunteers could contribute. You can also brainstorm, obviously, with your staff and your board on items that need to be done. Once you have your list, stop and answer these questions. What is the task? Who do we need to complete this task? Here you want to think about what skills are required or physical abilities that are required. Where is the task to be done? When does the task need to be completed? How will the volunteer complete the task? And most importantly, why is this task important to our mission? To be most effective, volunteer opportunities should be diverse in nature and level of involvement. Think everything from 1 hour of stuffing envelopes to once a week water quality monitoring to a 6-month or a year commitment to helping with an annual gala. Potential volunteers need to have multiple entry points into your organization, ways in which they can test the water, if you will, before diving in. So think about breaking bigger tasks into smaller ones and try to cater your opportunities to various ages and skill sets. And you should be also identifying both inside and outside volunteer opportunities. Also, be sure to assign time commitments. And remember, it's so important to link every opportunity to your organization's mission. So make sure to circle back and answer that. Why does this activity matter? How is this going to help us achieve our mission? Now let's take a closer look at the role of the volunteer coordinator. Every organization functions differently and has different resources. So the position and role of the volunteer coordinator should be adapted to suit your organization's particular needs and may well change over time. Your volunteer coordinator may be a paid staff member, or it may be their only job, but more than likely it's part of a larger job description. Oftentimes the role is assigned to the development or fundraising staff person. Or your coordinator may be a volunteer themselves. The responsibilities can be divided among and between staff and volunteers as long as it clearly spells out who is responsible for which activities. The activities listed here, recruitment and selection, orientation and training, management and retention, rewards and recognition, and evaluation, are an overview of the typical responsibilities of a coordinator. We'll go into more detail in a few minutes, but for now, it's important to realize and appreciate the broad skill set needed to implement a successful volunteer program. I'd like to add that personality is also an important factor in choosing a volunteer coordinator because it's a key role of the job. They need to be able to match skills, experiences, and expectations of your volunteers, And you want someone who's outgoing and is good at making people feel welcomed and appreciated. As we go through these next slides, you'll hear a change in my language. We're trying to move the paradigm in volunteer management from volunteer management to volunteer engagement. I want you to start thinking about how you can cultivate and network your volunteers, not just recruit them, and think about ways you can provide support, not just supervise them. Okay, so you've identified some volunteer opportunities for your group, and you have a person who is dedicated, full or part-time, to managing your program. Now it's time to start thinking about cultivation and recruitment. The most important thing to do is ask. And when you ask, you need to do so in the most specific terms possible. Not just, hey, do you want to volunteer with our organization? But how about helping us next Saturday from 2 to 5 p.m. at the river cleanup? 90% of volunteers volunteer because they were asked. You need to make sure you're describing your tasks clearly. Jargon can be intimidating. So someone who says they're not interested in monitoring macroinvertebrates may actually be quite willing to put on hip boots and collect critters from the river bottom. So think about the ways you're inviting and asking. Think about the language you're using in your invitation to ask for volunteers. And I've said it already, but I'm going to say it again, explain why. People get motivated by knowing how their particular tasks, even if it's stuffing envelopes for 2 hours, fits into the overall goals and strategies of your organization. Explain the benefits of participation. Will the volunteer meet interesting people, learn new skills, get their picture in the newspaper, eat pizza, or help restore the habitat for a threatened species? Spell out the reasons that might motivate them. Also, request a specific commitment, whether you're asking for 2 hours a day or 1 night a week or a substantial commitment for our 3-month project. Clearly explain the specific time obligation you're seeking. Be enthusiastic. Hopefully your volunteer events are all fun and exciting, so be sure to convey that to your potential recruits. And finally, learn to accept no and don't take it personally. Guilt tripping or begging may work just once, but graciously accepting that people lead busy lives and can't help each and every time you call will create a mutually respectful relationship with a long-term future. So setting aside some time to recruit volunteers on a regular basis can be tough. One suggestion is to designate a time of year to have a campaign focused on volunteer engagement and awareness. A campaign can be as simple as sending out an email to your listserv, posting on social media, or updating your website for a short amount of time. We need volunteers. Here are the types of things volunteers for our organization do. If you're interested, contact us. Or you could spend an entire month surveying, collecting stories, highlighting long-term volunteers. This is a great way to show your appreciation and also get other people interested in volunteering. Create new volunteer materials and more. You can even have virtual volunteer hangouts online. I've actually seen some organizations that do this, or host a couple of in-person meetups to get to know your volunteers and have them meet each other. One of the best ways to recruit volunteers is to ask board members for help and hold Bring a Friend events. And enlist your volunteers, your current volunteers in recruitment. So some of the best recruiting is done through existing volunteers. Ask them to bring a friend to the next event or share a name of someone who might like to get involved in your work. You should also think about sources in your community like colleges, service clubs like the Aquinas or Rotary, local businesses or corporations. They often promote a culture of community service and are a great resource to find volunteers. You know, winter's a really good time right now for watershed organizations to do recruitment and training because there's less activity on the river and people may be looking for things to do since they can't get outside and paddle and fish. So send out a short survey to your online community of donors asking about their interests and skills related to volunteer opportunities that your organization needs. It's another thing you can do is create an easy online form to fill out on your website for those interested in volunteering. And you can actually, one great way to do this is to use like Constant Contact or MailChimp, and you can embed these forms on your website and it automatically populates your mailing list and gives you alerts when somebody signs up. Use your website and social media sites to promote your opportunities as well as share stories about your volunteers. As I said, one of the best ways to recruit volunteers is talk about the good experiences that others have had volunteering with your organization. And finally, another resource is to consider adding your organization or available opportunities to online communities. And I've listed some of those here. You know, just Google them and you can find out more. But Catch a Fire, Volunteer Match, LinkedIn for Nonprofits is a great one. So take a look at these resources. It's important to identify what skills and interests your volunteers bring to your organization. I've talked about you identifying your tasks and what skills you require for these different opportunities, but now it's time to switch and think about the volunteers and what their expectations are in volunteering with your organization. So one way you can do this is through a simple questionnaire, and I believe I've included some resources for Autumn to share with you along these lines. It's important to understand what motivates your volunteers. So ask them to rank their needs and expectations. This is just a quick list of 9 or 10 ideas here. You can certainly come up with your own. For example, some volunteers really want to use their professional skills, the things that they do every day, and feel like they can contribute, and others want to do anything but what they do every day, right? So again, think about some of the things you might ask your volunteers and rank them in order of importance. The better you know your volunteers, the better you can match their skills and expectations to your needs and create a win-win for everyone. It's also a good time for me to stop and mention that you should be capturing as much information about your volunteers as possible in your records management or database system. We're going to talk about this in a few more slides, but I want to go ahead and mention it now too. Okay, so once you recruit your volunteers, then you need to turn your attention to engaging and managing and retaining them. So it's important to create a culture that welcomes volunteers. Every volunteer should receive an orientation to your organization. Best practice is to have a formal orientation process by which volunteers receive an introduction to your organization and the opportunities available. The orientation typically should include why your organization exists, your purpose and your mission, what work you do, what are your current programs, and what's the current progress on those programs. This knowledge brings a sense of purpose to each volunteer's tasks and allows them to see how their work fits into the overall mission of your organization. We recommend that as part of your orientation process, you create a volunteer handbook, and that typically includes general information about your organization, again, that mission, program, important policies and procedures. It also would include necessary paperwork, contact information, emergency contact information, maybe a questionnaire to determine their interests and skills. And it would include a description of the volunteer opportunities. Again, remember to include estimated time commitments or special skills or physical requirements needed to do the task. You need to consider if there's also any special training that the volunteer needs or demonstrations of office equipment or specific monitoring tools as part of the onboarding process. It might be useful to think about the kind of help you needed when you've been a volunteer for an organization. It's important to clearly explain how to do the task and design the training opportunity design the training appropriate to the complexity of the task. So, training can run the gamut of, a formal group training, or you may choose to allow volunteers to shadow a staff member or another more experienced volunteer. Make sure to allow each individual the leeway to perform the task within their own style, within the parameters you set. Where appropriate, again, you should be matching volunteers to their needs and interests. And don't forget about providing professional development opportunities where and when possible. It's a great way to encourage engagement and grow your volunteers into leadership positions. You should structure your volunteer program so that each volunteer has a direct connection to an identified supervisor and receives the level of support and supervision appropriate for their role. It's important to maintain constant communication with your volunteers by providing defined tasks, clear deadlines, verbal instructions, and even checkpoints. You don't want your volunteers to feel like you're micromanaging them, but you definitely want to be able to give them feedback and receive feedback from them. As I said, receiving feedback from them is so important. So ask your volunteers for their suggestions about the tasks and the process, as well as let them know what they did well and their areas for improvement. When someone stops volunteering, an exit interview is a great way to gather information about the way your organization works with volunteers. Along with support, there may be times when you have to resolve a conflict or manage grievance process, and we'll talk in a few minutes more about managing difficult personalities. You also must invest in your volunteer recognition. You need to develop ways to recognize and reward your volunteers' efforts, and the most important form of recognition certainly is just a thank you. It's a good idea to set up regular events where everyone involved in your organization can celebrate your work and socialize informally. So consider inviting your volunteers to an office picnic or plan a special volunteer thank you event. A quick note about awards and rewards. Rewards are something given for service or attainment, and awards are a kind of special recognition that only a few people receive. You should be paying attention and giving both. Your volunteer program should be evaluated regularly to assess the impact of the program as well as cost and benefits involved in recruiting, engaging, and supervising your volunteers. Also consider things like which volunteer opportunities attract the most interest. Are there better times of the year to recruit and train volunteers? You should be fine-tuning your program every year. And finally, keep records. In addition to basic contact information, you should be keeping notes on what your volunteers like to do, their other interests, and what they've helped with. These records will help decide who to ask for what tasks, and also give you information on who you might start to encourage and cultivate as a leader. Wanted to take a quick moment to talk about episodic volunteering. Episodic volunteers are those who volunteer periodically rather than on a consistent basis. Many young volunteers today are hard to pin down to a consistent schedule or even to come back at all. So some organizations focus their retention efforts elsewhere. However, studies have shown that many episodic volunteers would like to volunteer more often if their needs are met. Because episodic volunteers have less contact with your organization, they're less likely to communicate dissatisfaction with their experience. They tend to perform smaller actions before fully committing to a cause and prefer hands-on types of projects. So, how do you keep them coming back? You need to get your volunteers connected to your organization. Make sure they leave the volunteer event with a sense of satisfaction and enjoyment. The goal is to get them committed to your organization as opposed to simply the experience of volunteering. The more volunteers feel connected to your organization, the more likely they will show up consistently. Make sure all volunteers understand the great impact that they are making, no matter how infrequently they come. Allow ample opportunity for episodic volunteers to explore other areas and volunteering positions, and consider hosting fun meet and greet events. You need to make sure that they're in the know. Again, clearly defining those roles and responsibilities, as well as project goals, helps set expectations for the volunteers and affects their level of satisfaction and experience. It can be easy for episodic volunteers to get lost in a busy nonprofit. However, satisfaction increases significantly if you keep your episodic volunteers in the loop, and the satisfaction will help them keep coming back. Keep some volunteer opportunities flexible to encourage more signups so that they don't have to have previous knowledge to help at this current event. And resist pressuring episodic volunteers to make long-term commitments, but make sure all roles, both episodic and long-term, are well-defined. And finally, again, I'm going to say it, ask for their feedback. It's easy for an episodic volunteer to walk away unhappy with their experience and never come back, and for you never to know why. So you should be offering just as many, if not more, feedback opportunities for your episodic volunteers as for your long-term volunteers. Ask them firsthand what they thought about their experience, what worked and what didn't. It's important to deepening your relationship with those volunteers. Volunteers feel like they have some say in how an organization is run, report feeling more valued, and are more likely to keep volunteering for that organization. Lastly, ask your episodic volunteers why they prefer occasional volunteering. This may give you more insight into their motivations as well. Okay, so I've mentioned the need for records management in a database system several times already. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to have a way to track your volunteer contact information, skills and interests, hours volunteered, and jobs performed. Your system does not have to be elaborate. However, the more information you can easily capture and query about your volunteers, the better. If you can, note your volunteers' preferences. For instance, they may hate phone calls, they may prefer outside work. Note their schedule. They're willing to work in the afternoons, on Tuesdays or Thursdays, and any other personal data or details they've shared with you. Furthermore, try to record each time your volunteers agreed to do something, whether or not they showed up. If they agreed to make phone calls on 3 different evenings but never actually did, perhaps it's time to check in and offer a new activity. This is an example of a volunteer tracking form, and I think, Autumn, I've included this as well in the resources. At the bottom in blue, I want to call your attention to the 2017 value of volunteer time. This is established by the nationally recognized nonprofit independent sector. You should look this number up annually, and it's available every April, so that you can put a monetary value on your volunteers' contributions made to your organization. One reason you'll want to value your volunteer time is that it can often be used as in-kind match for many grants. So don't leave money on the table. You should be tracking those hours and valuing those volunteer hours. This is the second page of that tracking form, and as I said, along with a link to it, as I said, this is available along with a link to an article that mentioned several free database programs will be included in your resources. So Autumn, I want to make sure we have that article as well for everybody. At this point, I also want to mention, and I know it's on our resource slide, there's a website called TechSoup, one word. And if you're not already a member, you should look into it as soon as we get off this webinar. TechSoup is a great website where nonprofits can get deep discounts on computer software and hardware. And it's affiliated with Google Nonprofits, which is another great potentially free service and resource for you as well. We're not affiliated with either organization, but again, as the former ED of a small watershed group, I relied heavily on these sites and got a lot of value out of them. Okay, so once you have your basic volunteer program in place, you need to start thinking about how volunteers move through your organization. The volunteer pyramid can help you create and assess your structure of your volunteer involvement, and it can help you maximize the types of volunteers you have, and also how you might build volunteer engagement and leadership in your organization. Outside the pyramid is the general public. That's your targeted constituency, right? People who are not yet involved with your organization. Your task here is to come up with ways to introduce these folks. Think, tabling events at the library or your community event, special events, newsletter signups. How can you engage with them and bring them into your organization as a donor and as a volunteer? The bottom or base level of the pyramid is your membership. These are the people who attend your events, the folks on your mailing list, or the people who volunteer when asked, but not on an ongoing basis. The middle level contains those who take responsibility for ongoing tasks. These are your water quality monitors, your newsletter editors and contributors, your committee members. Many groups find that they have clear positions at the top and bottom of their pyramid, but they don't have clearly defined roles or many people active in the middle level. A lack of volunteer leaders at the middle level of your pyramid can hold your organization back from growing and becoming more effective. At the top level is your board of directors, right? These are your quintessential volunteers. Board service is an important part of volunteer continuum, and the individuals that are serving on your board are engaged in a highly skilled, year-round, sustainable form of volunteerism. It's important to try to recruit board members from within your organization and move them up the pyramid. I mean, after all, how effective can a board member be if they have no previous connection to your organization? At the very least, their first year on their board will be spent learning about the organization and not fully contributing to the work of the board. For that reason, I really caution you to not move people too quickly up or even instantaneously up your pyramid. If people move up the pyramid, they are investing more time and have greater involvement in your organization, right? The arrow on the side there is indicating that. And you typically have fewer volunteers at each level as you go up the pyramid. So here are just a few questions you should be asking about your volunteer program as it relates to the pyramid. How do you invite volunteers to first get involved, right? Or more broadly, how can you currently reach out and engage the general public? Can you create a personal invitation for a specific volunteer opportunity? What tasks or opportunities do you provide for volunteers at each level of the pyramid? Again, I'm going to go back to those written job descriptions. So, divide them up on that pyramid and see how many different opportunities you have at each level and put them in that handbook. How many volunteers do you currently have at each level? If you want to grow your volunteer program, it might make sense for your organization to set goals for the number of volunteers you would like to recruit at each level of the pyramid and track that over time. And finally, how do people currently move from one level to another in your organization? Would you like to change the way volunteers move through your organization? If so, can you create a way to do this? Again, keep the pyramid in mind. It will help you organize and structure your opportunities and assess how people move from one level to another in your organization. It's a great thing to have in your toolbox. So now let's talk about how you start to move volunteers up your pyramid. While you may not know the life story of every person who shows up for your annual one-day river cleanup, some volunteers will stand out as being especially skilled. You may think they have a great potential to become a consistent volunteer, one of those mid-level pyramid folks, or eventually even a leader in your organization. The first thing to know is that leaders are developed. Very rarely, if ever, will you have a new volunteer assume a leadership position in your organization, nor would you necessarily want this to happen. Rather, you should be looking for some signs or cues, right? Do you know someone who's willing to commit more time and energy? Have you seen someone who has a desire to assume greater responsibilities, or someone who's seeking professional development and more training opportunities? We recommend that you take the time at least once a quarter to stop and think about a few people who may want to take on increasing responsibilities and develop a stronger relationship with your group. Have a personal conversation with them. What do you know about this person's interests and skills? What else do you know about them? Get to know them better. Consider providing training and additional opportunities for leadership roles, such as have them be a speaker at one of your events, speak on behalf of your organization, have them learn internal systems, or recruit and coordinate others. Think about the next 6 months and make a list of the opportunities and ways in which you can invite them to become more involved. Then track their interest and involvement in your database. This is a great time to pause and talk about what motivates volunteers. You're not going to move folks up your volunteer pyramid if they're not motivated, and one of the best, most simple ways to do that is to thank them. Let them know that their work is appreciated, that they and their work is appreciated. Even though we know how it feels to be unappreciated, we sometimes forget to thank those around us, or we assume somebody else has already done it. You can't afford to have people, especially those who care deeply about your cause, walk out the door because they feel unappreciated. There are ways to show your appreciation, but be sure to make your thanks as personal as possible. Don't just say thanks for your help. Tell your volunteers specifically what you appreciated about them and their work. For example, Autumn, I'm so thankful for the time you spent yesterday afternoon helping us enter our water testing data. It's important that this data be entered in a timely and accurate manner, and your keen attention to detail means I never have to worry about errors. You should also consider what type of appreciation is appropriate for the specific volunteer. So I've talked a lot about the need to know what motivates your volunteers. Finding out more about your volunteers can be as easy as asking the question, why did you join, or what do you hope to get out of working on this committee? Even if people don't answer directly, it will at least give you some clues as to their volunteer expectations and needs for which you can appropriately thank them for their efforts. For example, if you know that your volunteer really likes citizen science, you then might arrange for them to have lunch or coffee with the head of your monitoring program. Remember that your board of directors are all volunteers as well and need to be thanked in appropriate ways throughout the year. As I've said, saying thank you is the bare minimum for motivating volunteers. Tangible gifts sometimes are also a great way to show your appreciation, and these don't have to be elaborate or expensive to be thoughtful. And a side benefit, for example, if you're giving swag, you can boost your visibility in the community. Think bumper stickers, T-shirts, magnets, hats. So it's all about them, all about your volunteers. They give you their time, their talents, and often their treasure without asking anything in return, and you need to value that. People are our most important resources, and you have to achieve your organization's goals. So by truly appreciating your volunteers, you can motivate and involve them over the long period of time. In our last few slides, we're going to pivot and talk briefly about waivers, difficult personalities, and volunteer burnout. Waivers of liability have become a common part of our culture. You'll hardly find a parking lot ticket or a cup of coffee without a prominently placed message releasing the company from liability. But do they really work? If a volunteer is somehow injured while engaged in one of your organization's activities, a waiver of liability will not simply erase your problem. Rather, your liability will be determined primarily by the degree to which your actions were negligent. Whether or not you first obtained a waiver of liability, the most important consideration will be whether or not you took all reasonable safety precautions and sought to minimize risks as much as possible. If you knowingly send your volunteers out on a river at flood stage in leaky boats without PFDs, you will have a liability problem. A waiver of liability will help you in circumstances where an injured volunteer, or more likely their insurance company, bases a claim of negligence on your failure to warn the volunteer of the dangers inherent in river environments. That is, a waiver of liability will primarily be effective as an acknowledgement that the volunteer knows that the river can be dangerous and accepts the risk. No matter how careful you are, the volunteer still may get injured. Liability waivers, thus, are primarily an exercise in diplomacy. As you attempt to ensure that your volunteers are properly informed in a way that is accurate yet sensitive, you should attempt to ensure that they're properly informed. For this reason, it's a good idea when crafting your liability waiver to attempt to work with a pro bono or attorney whenever possible. There is the Federal Protection Act of 1997, and this aims to promote volunteerism by limiting and in some cases completely eliminating A volunteer's risk of tort or civic wrongdoing when acting on behalf of a nonprofit organization or government entity. People who volunteer to assist nonprofit organizations run the risk that their actions, while well-intentioned, may cause harm to another. If those actions are deemed negligent, the volunteer may face civil liability for damages caused by the negligent conduct. All states have some statutory precautions for volunteers, and the Federal Volunteer Protection Act preempts state laws that are less protective but allows states to pass laws with greater protections. Because each state's approach is different, it's important to identify what actors, actions, and liability protections are covered under your specific state statutes and those that are not. Of course, the most effective way to manage the risk of being sued is to reduce the risk of harm in the first place. So consider that your volunteers might expose your organization to the same risks as your employees and treat them accordingly. This may include required background checks of volunteers, special trainings and/or certifications. Best practices include a comprehensive risk management program, and volunteer training is important. They need to be informed of safety procedures, and you should have a robust procedure for reporting concerns. In fact, some insurance companies actually offer special discounts or programs to help nonprofits reduce risks, so I would encourage you to look into that as well. It's important to remember that each volunteer plays a unique role in a group and contributes different talents and abilities. Problems can arise when individuals prevent the group from making progress or when they start driving some members of the group crazy. Ignoring poor performance or disruptive behavior by volunteers can have disastrous effects on the rest of your team and can draw valuable energy away from more important tasks. In addressing a volunteer problem, try to deal with the issue rather than the personality. Start by understanding the situation accurately. If you need to, pull in someone who is familiar with the situation to get another perspective. Do this before you meet with the individual. Take some time to figure out what the problem might be. Is it a character issue? The images here on the screen are from the NOAA Facilitator Training on Dealing with Disruptive Behaviors. This link is shared in your resources, and it's a great tool for your conflict resolution toolbox, so check it out. Is it a competency issue? Does he or she lack the skills necessary to do the job, or maybe they misunderstood the instructions? Or is it a chemistry issue? Maybe he or she is a good and competent person, but they just don't fit, but the fit just isn't right. So defining the problem helps you to solve the problem. So separate the person from the problem and talk about the work that isn't done or the specific problem the behaviors caused, not the qualities of the individual. It's way too easy to say that he or she's the problem. Also, own everything you can. It's almost never 100% the volunteer's fault. So find out what you've done wrong. Maybe you didn't train them properly or give them the right tools that they needed. And be upfront about that. Once in a while, you even realize it's not them at all, but it is you. So put your ego aside and assume the best intentions. So since there's likely a legitimate reason why the volunteer behaved the way they did. And finally, of course, look for solutions. So maybe suggest a change that's good for the individual and good for the organization. Team them up with somebody else or see if they'd prefer a different task or role. And lastly, volunteer burnout. There's often a cycle of volunteers moving in and out of leadership roles as other commitments and energy levels change. So often volunteers want short-term assignments. Rotating responsibilities can help keep everyone involved, avoid people feeling left out of important decisions, and avoid burnout. Likewise, look for signs of burnout. If a volunteer's needs are not being met, they may get frustrated, their enthusiasm may decline, they may become slower at getting things done, and they may be absent, late, or quit altogether. Another big mistake is taking advantage of your best volunteers. You should avoid rewarding good volunteer work with more work. This often results in us burning out our best people. So Autumn, as I said, here is a resource slide with a lot of the different websites and things that I've talked about today. And I know Autumn has some other resources that I shared that she'll be sending out in an email as well. So do know that you have this resource slide here to refer back to. And with that, it's time to recap. Volunteers play a critical role in many river and watershed organizations, and effective groups are good at leveraging their volunteers' enthusiasm and skills to benefit their mission. So while you may reap the benefits of donated labor, the value of volunteer action goes far beyond any price that can be ascribed to their work. Remember, as I said earlier, every volunteer who takes your case to heart, your message to the community, and your mission into their lives brings us closer to achieving our collective goals. I hope that you've gained some new ideas to develop and grow your volunteer program today, and I strongly encourage you to take 5 minutes after today's webinar to identify some action steps that you're going to take as a result of this training. And with that, I thought I'd end here on the New River Valley Gorge and end our journey here and take some questions. So Autumn, can you help with that?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please enter them into your panel. There's a tab for questions, and there's also a tab for chat. So I think either one of those, you can get us questions. So we had one come in while, Caroline, while you were giving your presentation, and that question was related to fundraising. It's asking which website has the 2 fundraising lessons.
The 2 fundraising lessons? I'm not sure. I did mention at the beginning, so River Network, we're currently in the middle of a 5-part webinar series on fundraising. And we've done 3 of those, so those recordings are available by contacting me directly, because you do have to be a dues-paying member of River Network to access those. And we have 2 more sessions coming up. The one in February is on making the ask, and the one in March is going to be on new fundraising techniques like peer-to-peer fundraising and online online giving days. So all that information is available on our website, or certainly if somebody wants to contact me directly, and I'll put up now, let's see if I can go to the next slide, my contact information here. If somebody wants to contact me directly, I'd be happy to share more information about those, if that is indeed the question. If not, please reach back out and clarify the question a little more, and I'd be happy to answer again.
Okay, and it looks like we had a hand raise. So I think this person, Judy Hamilton, wants to ask a question. So I'm going to unmute you, Judy.
Hi, Caroline. I just wanted to thank you for a great presentation. I feel remotivated. I have one question, and that is, with so many different organizations needing a lot of help right now, and a lot of the organizations and the people who regularly volunteer are feeling a bit of burnout and discouragement based on things that are happening with the current Congress and president. What number one thing would you say that I would need to say to them to keep us going forward?
That's a great question, Judy, and I appreciate that. The number one thing I would say is, your work is making a difference. The more you can, again, I'll go back to tying the volunteers' activities to your mission. The more you can show that their work is moving the needle forward, the more you're going to keep them engaged, the more you're going to keep them volunteering for your organization. So you really have to find ways to show that they're making a difference, that your organization is making a difference. So ways you can do that, I think it's great. I see this time right now as such an opportunity. I mean, civic engagement is huge right now. I think so many people, feel, have so concerns about everything that's going on politically, socially, and I think it's just an opportunity if you can present to them, hey, I hear you're frustrated. I hear you're worried. Come help us. We can make a difference together. So it's really about marketing your volunteer program and saying, hey, we're part of the solution. If you're concerned, if you're worried, if you're aggravated, come join us. We feel the same way. Let them know, that you're concerned too. We feel the same way, and let's work on this. Let's work on this issue together. Let's get in front of our, state legislators. Let's get a letter writing campaign going. If advocacy is one of the strong pillars of your organization, then you're in a great position to say, we're taking a stand. We're letting our our concerns be known, and here's the great work we're doing. So again, I think it goes back to how well you can tie, the work that they're doing to your organization and make them feel like they're making a difference. It's that whole making a difference in the world. And I get right now, it's overwhelming almost that, how can we move the needle when so many things seem to be going against us? But I would counter that with what I have seen going on is so many more people are interested in getting involved that haven't been involved in the past. So also tapping into some new volunteers in the community, maybe reach out to some, to the broader community that you haven't approached before and say, hey, are you concerned about what's going on? If so, come join us, come take a stand. Let's work on these issues together. So as much as it might seem like a challenge, I also see it as an opportunity. I hope that's helpful. Some, Judy.
It is. Thank you.
Okay, and we had another question come in. Any suggestions for engaging younger volunteers in a low population rural area? We are a pretty gray-haired group right now.
That's a great question. I think technology is a great way to reach the younger volunteers. So on social media, I get you could be a gray-haired group, but I'll tell you, I heard a statistic recently that the fastest growing population on Facebook are the gray-haired, the grays they're called, the gray-headed folks. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't discourage you from getting on Facebook, talk about your organization, get some people involved, get some young people involved. And once you get a few, then ask them to start bringing their friends. Ask them what might be of interest. If you can make inroads with a small group, whether you go to a school maybe and offer to do a project to get a couple kids involved after school working with your organization through community service. I know my kids' school here on the Eastern Shore, and I live in a very rural, one of the least populated and poorest communities in Virginia. In fact, we're a county of 12,000 people. But a lot of schools have community service programs. So reach out to your schools and find out if there are any community service or suggest a community service opportunity and get a few kids involved in your organization, and then, or younger folks, if it's, maybe you have a community college locally, we do, that's a great resource to reach out to your local community college and see if you can get just a couple kids or young adults interested. And as I said, grow your program from there. Ask them to bring their friends. Ask them what types of activities, they would most be interested in doing, and let them kind of lead the way for you.
Okay, the other question we had come in, can we use this time to coordinate between organizations?
Is that maybe a question, Autumn, for the folks on the line?
Yeah, I think that's what she's getting at, and I don't know that we have time to do that, but that is a very good thing to do.
I think it's great, and in terms of thinking of volunteers and shared volunteers, I'm not sure how widespread your groups are who are on the line, how widespread apart they are, but I think it was a great idea to maybe suggest coming together and doing some collaborative projects and growing your volunteer base that way as well.
Okay, that's all the questions that we had come into the chat box. I think we have one more hand raised. Jeff Witten, I'm going to unmute you to ask your question.
Hey, thank you. I live in Elkins, West Virginia. I'm on the Board of Trustees of Trout Unlimited. One of our distressing communications issues is that even among our leaders, our volunteer leaders across the country, emails going out to them are only opened about 15, and newsletters are only opened about 15% of the time. So one question I have is, River Network, what kind of open rate do you experience? The second thing is just to emphasize the importance of something like Facebook, in that as you pointed out earlier, so many of the older generation has the time to put in and may not be as savvy. Some type of seminar that will spin up or train the older people to get involved, or how to find a volunteer online communicator is very important. The third thing is that what we've realized is that so many people nowadays get their newsletters or any kind of communications, online communications, on their telephone, and not very many, you struggle to have a website or a newsletter that is easily readable on such a small screen. And I wonder what you've done to try to combat that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for the great questions. To answer your first one about our open rates for River Network, I haven't looked at the analytics closely, but I do remember, and as I mentioned, we have a new Director of Marketing and Communications, and she actually is combining two of our, just as of January 1, has combined two of our publications into one. So, our real focus is going forward, per her recommendation, is fewer, more concise, more meaningful communications is step one. I think historically what I've seen or heard us say is, our open rates are about 25%. So, I think you quoted 15. I wouldn't say that that's terribly far off. It really, I'm glad you're looking at that. The analytics are really great. And so, if you've got the time or a staff person, a volunteer who's interested in that, looking at those analytics, and you can actually do beta testing. You can send out, to the same newsletter to two different groups and use a different subject line, or change them slightly and see if one newsletter gets more of an open rate than another. But again, that takes some time to do that type of thing. Are you all still there? Autumn,
Yep.
Can you still hear? Okay. Sorry, I had a strange. Your entry is not valid. Your question about optimizing for the phone, you're exactly right. Any and all communications you do should be optimized for mobile viewing whenever possible. Again, my experience has primarily been with Constant Contact and MailChimp, and in both of those systems, and I know Constant Contact better than I know MailChimp, but I know for a fact in both of those systems they have newsletter templates that are optimized for mobile viewing. And unfortunately, what you find is that I know when I first started doing newsletters for organizations, I would, cram pack them. They were very visually appealing on my computer screen with lots of different columns and different pictures. But you're right, when that gets transferred onto a mobile device, it just wreaks havoc on it, and it looks awful, or it won't even open, or you get a bunch of errors. So really what you find is those optimized templates for newsletters are very, singular column. They're not as flashy, but you're right. I'd say, for us, for sure, again, looking at the analytics, the majority of people are opening our communications on their mobile device. So that's who we need to cater to. So definitely you should be looking at that, and I'm glad you are. Let's see, Facebook, you mentioned Facebook. I agree. I think, the Grays, the greatest generation, the Gray generation, they do have a lot of time. And I know in fact, my mother-in-law is just now entering onto Facebook, and I've enjoyed helping her. So maybe that's a great way to get some of your younger volunteers involved in helping some of the older folks in your organization do posts on social media. And with the changes now on Facebook, again, not my area of expertise so much, but I'm aware enough that I understand that going forward, an organization like River Network, we would do a post, and it would, based on the number of likes and shares, would come to the top of your feed. But now that's going to be based more on who shares our posts. So it's really important for organizations. I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't mention it. It's important for organizations to encourage your members who might be on Facebook or on your social media, but this is Facebook specific, to like and share your posts, because that's how it's going to continue the organic sharing of those posts now. Whereas in the past, there were other algorithms and things that would automatically have you appear in the feed. But now, the emphasis more is on what your friends and family members and colleagues are liking and sharing. So it's important to, if you do have a Facebook page for your organization, kind of take a look at that. And I have, Autumn, I'd be happy to share with you a nice piece that the Choose Clean Water Coalition Director of Communications sent out last week about Facebook. and I'll send you that email as well, just kind of summarizing those changes to Facebook. But one of the questions she asked for consideration is, the organization should actually step back and say, why are we using Facebook? So think about, why you're posting to Facebook, what you're posting on Facebook, why you're choosing to do it. And if it's an effective tool for you to communicate, then by all means, continue doing so, but do so wisely. Make sure that the time you're putting into that, you're going to get your return on investment. And if you're spending staff time doing that or boosting posts, those costs, there's some cost involved in that as well. So, Jeff, I hope that answered all three of your questions, I think.
Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have. So feel free to reach out to Caroline if you have any more questions. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the resources. And please remember to do the evaluation at the end of the webinar. And just really quick, I did get clarification on that previous question. She was meaning to use shared volunteers for collaborative projects. So that's a really good idea. So thank you everyone very much for joining our webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.